moderate this discussion, please welcome the Deputy Director of the Department of Navy's Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office, Dr. Jessica Zabecki.
I'd like to welcome my fellow panelists to the stage. If they'd come on up. I'm really honored today to share the stage with such a distinguished group of experts and scholars. I'll introduce them in a minute, but I just wanted to set up the conversation that we're about to have for you first. The theme of today's regional discussion is creating a change through data and an evaluation mindset. And I think that this group on stage truly believes in the value of data and program evaluation to get where we need to be on sexual assault and sexual harassment prevention. Our panelists share a common purpose in using data to address sexual violence to inform healthier climates. This group is also part of what Ms. Cohen mentioned as the return on investment for these regional discussions. As we share our data, examine ways to align our metrics with the goal of better informing our prevention efforts and truly understanding if we're making progress. So I hope what you'll hear during today's session is why we think it's so important to have these conversations about truly understanding our data and aligning our metrics. That in the spirit of transparency, we're actually sharing our data with you to start a conversation about being transparent about our data and talk about our way forward. So with that, I'd like to introduce the first panelist right next to me, Dr. Emily Rothman. She's a professor at the Boston University School of Public Health and holds secondary appointments in the Department of Pediatrics and the Department of Emergency Medicine. During her career, she has conducted numerous evaluations of dating and sexual violence programs. Dr. Rothman is currently working with the Department of Navy on program evaluation efforts under an Intergovernmental Personnel Act agreement. Next to her sits Dr. Angela Catena, and she is the Title IX coordinator for the University of New Mexico and also the lead for their campus climate survey. Prior to joining the University of New Mexico, Dr. Catena was a clinical assistant professor in the counseling psychology program at Arizona State University, where she served on ASU's Advisory Council on Sexual Assault Prevention. Next to Dr. Catena is Dr. Nate Galbreath. He is the acting director for the Department of Defense Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office. Selected to be a senior executive in December 2016, Dr. Galbreath is the department's expert for prevention and response programs and the relationship to behavioral health, forensic science, criminal investigation, and sex offender treatment. And last but not least is Mr. Joseph Storch, who's Associate Counsel in the State University of New York's Office of General Counsel and Chair of the Student Affairs Practice Group. He serves as Principal Investigator on more than $9 million in grants and external funding in violence prevention and response. Mr. Storch serves as the lead investigator on SUNY's campus climate survey and many other initiatives that support sexual assault prevention and response efforts. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Dr. Galbreath, the Department of Defense has collected data on sexual assault since 2006. Why is collecting standardized data so important to ending sexual assault?
Am I on? Good morning. I think one of the things that I would tell you is everyone needs, in order to understand this program, is a common set of facts, and to understand the extent of the problem, as was spoken about in the last panel. It's so important to understand how much of your population is experiencing these things, so that you can understand to what extent are you actually seeing the folks coming forward and understanding, okay, how much of the problem am I seeing? And I will tell you that this data, as standardized as you can get it, and reaching out to all of the different things that drive what your data should include and what it should say, is very important. And I think that it definitely shakes, it causes senior leaders in governmental organizations, boards of trustees to shake in their boots when they begin to see some of this information. The experience that I had was that when I arrived at the Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office in 2007, just about a year and a half after it opened up, I noticed that we were counting the number of reports that came in the door, but as a clinical psychologist, I wanted to know, well, where's the rest of the story? There's so much more here that we can tell. And when I was able to find out that, that the numbers were the 2,000 or so reports that we collected in about 2006, 2007, 2008, the denominator was actually closer to 34,000. Senior leaders in the department did not want to know that number. That was, matter of fact, the words were to me, we'd hate to see the department get saddled with a number like that. And my response back was, well, we'll never get better. If we don't know what the extent of this problem is, we won't be able to track through this over time. And so over time, what I would tell you is that standardized data not only gives you a foundation from which to speak, it helps you track that progress over time. It lets you see the challenges that you have with regard to where do we need to go, what do we do next. And for leaders, it helps you chart the course for what the future can look like. That data over time it's going to change. We had a decade of progress where we saw the rates of sexual assault, the past year prevalence of sexual assault come down, but then in 2018, we saw the numbers come up again. Your approach has to change, and it's a constantly changing problem. Technology, social interaction, all develop and change the face of sexual assault and sexual harassment. And unless you are actively out there capturing this information, not only in your reports, but also in your prevalence, you will never know, for example, that in the Department of Defense, comparable numbers of men and women, just in numbers, experience sexual assault every year. And we would not have known that unless we'd done the math, because our prevalence rate of sexual assault for women is higher than it is for men, but because we're 85% male, our first year, that 34,000 number, 20,000 of those were men and 14,000 of those were women. Over time, we've actually seen that flip now. We actually have more women victims coming forward because our rates for men have come way down and stayed down. But that being said, those are all of the things that data that collecting from the very beginning can do for you, is help you see.
Great. Mr. Storch, is there any benefit to aligning our metrics? What do we stand to gain from working together across civilian universities and the military?
So, thank you. And I think before I answer that question, I just want to say from a personal standpoint what a privilege it is to be here. Secretary Moodley and Melissa Cohen and Jess, and what you all have done going across the country is just incredible. And President Stokes and Francie and Angela and Heather and everyone who's been so welcoming. The fact that you have just about as many people in Albuquerque, New Mexico, as we had in Midtown Manhattan is a real testament to this great institution and to your colleagues and the colleges who are here. We must have 12 million people within an hour's drive, at least a midnight hour's drive of Midtown Manhattan. And maybe you don't have as much population close, but yet the room is full. And I'm just so honored and privileged and proud to be here with you. SUNY has scale. We are very, very big, and so everything we do is very big. And when we did our climate survey, we had more than 40,000 responses, and that gives us the ability to understand the experiences of our students at a deeper level than many smaller institutions who've conducted very well, very similar surveys, and they could tell you overall prevalence, but maybe they can't figure out the details for the experience of a Native American female on their college campuses, because there's just not enough of them to be able to make that assumptions. And so we're very big, but the Department of Defense is bigger, and you have great service academies, and your students are coming from the same backgrounds our students are. Not only are we big, but we're pretty diverse. We have schools in Midtown Manhattan. We have schools in very rural New York. We have tech schools. We have a nuclear power plant. We have a College of Ceramics. We have a USS ship that we operate in our Maritime Academy, liberal arts colleges, engineering schools. And so we're able to see some of that diversity, and being able to align metrics, which is something I think we want to do overall with the Department of Defense, with the Armed Forces, and especially with the service academies, will let us see a bit more depth in the experience. They're all graduating high school, and many of our students are way beyond high school and coming, but many of our students are graduating high school, and they're coming with shared experiences. And I think we agree that we're not necessarily so pleased with what they're learning in high school and the experiences they're having coming out of high school, and you're seeing some of the same challenges that we are. And so in addition to what we can find internally, we're missing part of the story, and we think by aligning metrics, we can help begin to answer some of that. I will say for us, SUNY and from our chancellor and our provost, we're committed to fairly radical transparency in this. We are going to make a dashboard public. We are still working on weighting data and finishing that up. And we make our climate survey public. So institutions that don't have the depth of resources and the great researchers that we have, they can, if they want to, they can access our climate survey. We're not selling it. We just give it away on our website, and they can compare their own data to what we will over time publish, and that will give a very small institution quite a bit more power and understanding in comparing that, and that's something we're proud to do. So as these big institutions come together, I think it can not only help those big institutions, but help smaller and less resourced institutions as well.
And as a follow-up to that, you mentioned transparency and the importance of it. What do you see as the benefits or the barriers to other institutions being as radically transparent as SUNY is?
We have leadership who recognize, as you heard in the last panel, and as you heard from President Hillman, that numbers going up, numbers of reports going up. We want prevalence numbers to go down. We want reports to go up. God willing, sometime in my life they'll come close to meeting, and we'll feel much better about where that is. But the report numbers going up, my leadership understands that that's not a bad sign, and we have to spend a lot of time educating the media. And certainly in New York, we have a particularly aggressive media, I guess I would say, particularly they're an interesting bunch, and they don't always take the time to be educated. That is certainly a barrier for many institutions. What you raised is a universal temptation for large institutions. It's a universal temptation for big corporations. It's a universal temptation to just say, if I close my eyes, you can't see me, and we'll move on, and we'll put out a great press release and about something else, and we'll move on. Don't look at the man behind the curtain. That's a universal temptation, and I think it takes big organizations like the Department of the Navy, like the State University of New York, to go out and maybe do a little blocking for some of the runners from the smaller organizations who don't have the bandwidth to educate, and maybe big organizations have to take some hits, as certainly many large institutions, both in the military and in the academy have, and hopefully that lowers the barriers. But it is, no president wants to be known as the president of the school. You know, we have schools that we can think of scandals in the last 5 years that our grandchildren will know those schools by those scandals. The same way we think of Kent State and we think of the shooting that occurred before I was born, my children will think of Kent State and the shooting. We will think of many institutions that are in the modern day that will be, and no president wants to be that. So that is certainly a temptation, and I think maybe it takes some large organizations to go out and be some blocking tackles and take some of those hits and educate the media and the public about why transparency. And the numbers are, I mean, this is what I say to my group, and I have a great group who's much smarter than me with the data, and they say, well, you know, this is really weird. This number is going up and this number is going down, and we expected the opposite. And I would say, well, the numbers are what the numbers are, right? We're not changing the numbers, right? And maybe it just takes some of that.
Dr. Rothman, as scientists, we know that it can be challenging to compare data across different sources. When looking across the many different ways to measure sexual assault and sexual harassment, what have you found that's similar and what is different?
Yeah, thanks. So I think you mentioned that, along with Dr. Sharon Potter, who's here, we're working now with the Navy SAPR, very part-time. And one of the first jobs that you gave us a few months ago after the last regional dialogue was you came to us and you said, well, there are all these different estimates of prevalence from various campus climate surveys, or internally at Navy and DoD, we have some different surveys that we've done. How can we make sense of it all? When we're talking about alignment, it means how do we look at these prevalence statistics from all of these different sources, and can we make sense out of it? Or is what we're dealing with here really a bunch of apples and oranges? Because the way that the questions are worded is slightly different from survey to survey. And so we've engaged you all have engaged in this process, and I want to kind of tell you two things about it. So first of all, we've just been talking about there are advantages to aligning the wording of questions on surveys so that our metrics can talk to each other. They will allow us to make inferences about the various institutions and collectively, all together. If things match, then we'll have a better ability to do that. And so people have been coming to meetings. They've been talking about how is this possible to really make sure that survey questions match up and which institutions are going to be able to make those changes. And some great progress is being made on that front. At the same time, on sort of a parallel track, the other thing that we did was take a look at the survey questions that have been asked and what people have been measuring. And we said to ourselves, you know what, maybe it's not quite so bad as an apples and oranges situation. Maybe it's not true that the data totally doesn't talk to each other. Maybe it's just sort of different flavors of apples, and that we can actually tease out from the data that have been collected at various institutions questions that are similar enough that we can line them up and we can actually start making some of those inferences across institutions because the wording is similar enough. So now I'll tell you what is similar enough and also what is different that we still need to work on. So all of the different campuses and entities that are measuring sexual assault and harassment and rape have some kind of basic questions about unwanted sexual contact, about coercion, about drug-facilitated sexual assault, and all of them have questions about penetrative rape. And the questions are worded similarly enough that you can line those up and you can kind of look at the prevalence statistics across and get a general sense of whether they sync up. What is different is different entities have asked a different window of time or time frame that we need to look at. So some places ask the respondents on their surveys, has this happened to you in the past year? Other places ask, has this happened to you ever in your life? Some places ask, has this happened to you since you first got to campus or since you were first a student? And so lining up the time frames is something that we have to look at. It is true also that the exact wording of the questions can vary, and so some universities or some entities have a much broader way of framing the question and may get higher prevalence rates because of that. One way that people often look at results is broken down by gender. In some places, people are collecting female and male. In other places, they're also collecting non-binary gender. And so looking at some of the demographic categories and figuring out if those align is yet another piece of the work that remains to be done. All in all, I think there's a lot to celebrate about the fact that we are able to make progress on these two fronts simultaneously, which is looking at how we align and also using what we already have.
Dr. Catena, we've talked a little bit here about collaboration and working together to align our metrics. You've recently collaborated with federal agencies and researchers to collect data and conduct campus climate surveys. Some of these efforts will be highlighted later in another session. What has the University of New Mexico gained because of these collaborations?
So first I want to say there will be 3 separate sessions later that do discuss some of our climate survey data. One of them is with Dr. Teresa Cruz, who will be speaking about the McBee survey. I'll be speaking a little bit more about some of our surveys, and then Dr. Malatoon, who will be talking about evaluations and our gray area training. And so I don't want to speak too much about that because I don't want to take away from their presentations, but just know that that will be in the breakouts as well. Some of the stuff that we've been able to gain, obviously insight, and with that comes pros and cons. And as we're looking at this, I think one of the pieces, and you brought this up, was we do have that quantitative yes, no, maybe Likert scales, but what's driving that? What's underneath that? And oftentimes when we use these survey datas, there aren't enough qualitative questions. I'm a huge fan of qualitative data because we can see the pinpoints when we look at quantitative data, but what is really going on with the culture underneath it that might be promoting some of these behaviors that we're seeing within the numbers? And so I think using more qualitative data to really get the perspectives from those who are responding to the survey is really important. I think with that too, some of the other things that we've been able to gain from looking at this are the experiences of the different types of students that we have. As we're looking at this, we see our graduate population experiencing things a little differently than our undergraduate populations. What we see is, particularly with our graduate students, our power differentials and quid pro quo when they're working with faculty so closely, and the impacts that that can have, not just on their overall well-being, but their profession, lifelong. And so these are huge effects that we really need to take into consideration as we're having these conversations. And then with our undergraduate populations, I think those are a little more mainstream in what we would think of in terms of the sexual assaults and drinking and those pieces where we have our 18-year-olds coming in and being adults and leaving home for the first time. The other pieces that we've been able to see as we're using our data is an increase in mental health and perpetration. Now, New Mexico is not a rich state, and so we're using all the resources that we can to be able to address these issues, but we know that they are emerging issues, and so we're trying to get ahead of it as much as possible. Other things we're seeing are bi-directional aggression. So understanding the nuances of DV a lot more are going to be helpful because labeling someone a complainant or a respondent doesn't really give the full picture of what might be going on when they go home. Some of the other pieces that we've really been able to gain are who is and who isn't reporting. When we look at our climate surveys, they're in English. And so what can we do to then provide these surveys to maybe our non-native English speaking students, or how can we make these more accessible so that our student populations feel represented, feel seen? Another thing we've seen, and Dr. Rothman actually touched on this, was as we look at these climate surveys, they are very binary in terms of male, female. Sometimes they just have another section where it says other. What we've seen with ours is our trans and genderqueer folks are not filling out our surveys. And why would they if they see a survey that doesn't have their identity on there? So what that speaks to them is, we don't see you, we don't acknowledge you. We're gonna put you in an other box, if there even is an other box. And I think this also speaks to Armando's question earlier too, with how do we engage men more? And so how do we engage men? How do we engage our trans and our gender queer folks a little bit more? And the other pieces, as we're looking at our data, and I think what was really interesting for me was the males had a higher rate of believing that the university takes sexual misconduct seriously. And so as we look at that, and we look at who is and who isn't reporting and kind of the national conversations, we start to understand that a one-size-fits-all policy or even campaign doesn't work. We have to understand our different student populations. We have 4 branch campuses throughout the state, some in very rural areas. What we're doing on main campus may not translate to the needs of our students in our branch campuses. And so we really need to understand their populations, their needs, and be able to connect them with the services and support so that we can fully support our entire campus community.
Let's go ahead and get a little bit more in depth in our campus climate data in general. But before we do, I think it's important to frame what we're going to see in terms of the rates that we'll present next. Dr. Rothman, given your expertise in public health, including sexual assault prevention, how do we reconcile the push for immediate results? We have to make change with a focus on activities that we think will impact long term.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking this question. I personally have been employed working full-time on sexual and domestic violence prevention for 20 years. So I've been thinking about sexual assault, rape, homicide, all day, every day for 20 years. And I get tired sometimes. And so I really relate to, I think, the theme that's come up here today a lot, which is, what do we do when there's fatigue? What do we do when we feel fatigued and we're starting to feel hopeless? And what do we do when leadership near us is starting to feel hopeless or saying we need to see immediate change? So for me, the good news, or what I'm really grateful for, is I come to you from the field of public health. And public health has a number of successes that I can look to, and I'd like to share one of the success stories with you here now, because it's really inspirational thinking about some of the, using the formula and using the steps of how do you tackle a public health problem. People tackle the problems and things get solved. The trick is it can take a little while, but let me give you one particularly impressive example. So in the 1950s, there was an illness that was plaguing everyone. Death rates were you were twice as likely to die of this disease than cancer. And people didn't know what to do about it. They didn't know what was causing it. They looked at it and they thought, well, there's multiple causes, and they didn't know how they were going to solve it. Flash forward 70 years later, and the prevalence of this disease has fallen 350%. The disease is heart disease, which is still a #1 killer, but you and I are far less likely to die of heart disease, any of us, than we would have been 70 years ago. How did they create this incredible sea change? Because they really did do it. Well, they used data in order to understand who's being affected and what are some of the risk factors and how do we address them. And yes, they made incredible advances in terms of how do we respond to the people who have had a heart attack, they made improvements in medications and in medicine, which I liken to our sexual assault response. When after an assault has already happened, are we responding better? So yes, they did figure out how to respond better after someone had had a heart attack. But what they really figured out how to do was to make cultural changes that, the rates of smoking cut in half over a 40-year period. Rates of high cholesterol dropped precipitously over about a 40-year period, because somehow people managed to change the entire culture and affect how we eat and how we exercise and how we approach this issue overall. And I think often about our colleagues who were there in 1965, for example, looking at this situation where everybody smoked, for example. They smoked on airplanes, they smoked in cars, they smoked around babies, they smoked around in hotels and everywhere. It seemed normal. It was just all around them. And some of those of our hardworking colleagues maybe didn't make it until today to see that their efforts really paid off, and that the world is completely changed and maybe totally different than they might have imagined in 1965. We are in the 1960s or 1970s in terms of sexual assault prevention, if you'll accept my analogy, in that we are working very hard right now, and we may not be seeing the fruits of our labor in the immediate present. But if we can project ourselves 60 years forward, 70 years forward, we can create the same kind of cultural sea change that those people created back then. It takes an incredible amount of faith. and patience and investment in an issue where you see for a decade, for 2 decades, you're not seeing the precipitous drop that you're hoping for. But it isn't just heart disease. We know where I come from in public health. We did this with motor vehicle crashes. We did this with HIV. We did this with children's dental cavities. We have a formula, and if we apply it consistently and we apply it to this issue, we will make the same difference. So that is how I get myself through the day. Hopefully that's helpful. Yeah, some of you as well.
I think that's a great perspective. Thank you, Dr. Rothman. Dr. Galbreath, we're going to go to your slide now. And wondering if you could describe some of the overall trends in sexual assault that we've observed in the military.
Absolutely. So this goes along with what I mentioned at the outset. So when I arrived, our initial, just to orient you to what you're looking at, the blue line are our rates of prevalence as established by scientific surveys that the department's been doing on this issue since about 2006. The red line across the bottom are the number of reports that we've received from servicemen and women who've experienced a sexual assault. And since we're talking about definitions, in the Department of Defense, we have 2 components of sexual assault. One's a contact or touching or groping type crime. The others are penetrative crimes. And so our numbers across the bottom reflect both our unrestricted reports, which are reports to law enforcement and command for investigation, as well as our restricted or confidential reports that we talked about a little bit earlier. And just a note on confidential reporting, so important. When we go out and we talk to our people, and both in surveys and in focus groups, about what brings you forward, the whole idea that you can go to someone and talk about what happened to you and it's not going to get pulled into a process that you're going to be stuck in, it not only brings forward those people that may never ever go forward in the accountability process, but it also brings in those people who are interested in pursuing the allegation in an investigation or prosecution. But they are also very much interested in having that confidentiality that allows them to assess what are you going to do for me and how do you support me as you go through this system. So what we've tried to do is to track the past year prevalence of sexual assault versus the number of reports that we receive every year. Now the percentage numbers that you see going across the middle at the 10,000 line, that's essentially how our reporting rate, or how much of the problem have we seen over time. And you'll notice back in 2006, as I mentioned, the 2,200 or so reports, 2,300 reports, were only 7% of that 34,000 number that I spoke about earlier. As you see over time, we've seen reporting go up, and we've seen prevalence come down up through about 2016. And you'll notice that we estimated that the 4,800 reports or so that we received in 2016 were about a third of the prevalence that we measured. And you'll notice that in that prevalence measure through 2016, rates have changed. For women, they came down by 1/3. For men, they came down by 2/3. This is real progress. It's not success. It's real progress that I think that we see through the education, the focus, the senior leader speaking about this regularly and often. As a matter of fact, really in the Department of Defense, we didn't see a huge effort until our prevalence actually went up in 2012, and you saw that 26,000 number. Matter of fact, that was a number that really got the attention of a lot of people, both in Congress and in senior leadership in the Department of Defense, about what you're going to do. And I actually have to talk to you about the current era of our focus really ties back to this data being presented to the Secretary of Defense at the time, Mr. Leon Panetta, and the fact that he said, well, we got to do something about this. This is awful. Thank you, sir. Until that time, my office had never been inside the Secretary of Defense's office to talk about this issue. So this was a sea change in the department with regard to being able to speak about this in a in a data-based way. So Mr. Panetta came out in the, about 3 weeks later after we initially talked to him and made an announcement and actually set us on a prevalence versus reporting standard. And that has been the measure of our progress ever since. Now you'll notice that from 2016 to 2018, we see an increase in prevalence again. Well, that actually was very focused on 17 to 24-year-old women, that we'd seen rates of sexual assault go up. Rates for men stayed the same. So something changed. And so we had to dig back into our data. So one of the things that we do, as you were mentioning, is this is all quantitative data. This is all numbers. But in off years, we do focus groups with not only in our active force, but also with at the military service academies as well. And some of this, that qualitative data will give you kind of the leading edge theme development that you need to kind of really understand what's going on. And so one of the things that you might have heard that, as General Silveria mentioned, we just released the Service Academy report on the 30th of January. And one of the things that we developed out of the focus groups with the cadets and mids is that the senior leaders at the academy, the message hadn't changed over time, that they were continuing to really kind of identify the fact that sexual assault, sexual harassment had no place at the academies, that this was something that they were focused on, that they were going to be continuing to lead on. The challenge that we saw coming out of our focus group participants, though, is that the cadets and midshipmen told us, yeah, they're talking about it, but you know what? Our peer leaders, those kind of juniors and seniors that we're supposed to be looking up to, that are supposed to be leading in this area, they're not. As a matter of fact, some of them are silent in this area. They don't speak to this. They don't lead where they're supposed to. And so if we're downtown and we see somebody at a party, we see our peer leaders that are our cadets and midshipmen out there partying on and not really kind of acting as leaders that we would expect them to. So that's was a bit of a change for us to hear that message come through, which we think explained some of the changes that we've been seeing at the academies over time. Now again, there's no silver bullet. There's no one thing that you can do to change any of this. This reflects an entire system over time. But I will tell you, though, is that this data across the bottom reflects a change in response, and as far as the numbers of reports that come through. To be honest, about 90% of what we've done in the 14 years of the existence of the Sexual Assault Prevention Response Program is response. We have made sure that there are people that you can talk to, a sexual assault response coordinator at every installation, that SARC has a number of victim advocates that work for him or her that then meet with victims and help them through and understand what their reporting and service options are. We've added attorneys that represent victims. We've changed how investigators first meet a victim of sexual assault. We've changed how attorneys approach it and prosecute it as well. All of these things take time because just to bring those numbers up, we're seeing 1/3 of reports versus 7% of reports now. That's the payoff of a decade of investment of time. Now what we're looking at is our prevalence numbers are really, we sit around and we hope that things improve because our prevention efforts are not as robust, that we have and that's why you see this up and down over time as to we don't have a really good system to field our prevention efforts and sustain them because we've been so focused on response. And so now that's what the departments really began to change. And so in 2019, we've fielded a prevention system that all of the services have come on board with, that we're all working closely to. And our own self-assessments tell us that from the DoD throughout the services and at the academies, we all have a long ways to go with prevention. But with that investment in those things that actually bring your prevalence numbers down, that will become more predictable over time. And I think that's what we'll see the next progress piece in.
Thank you for those insights on the data. Mr. Storch, we're going to go to your slide next. And can you talk a little bit about what SUNY has learned from your campus climate survey?
Sure. So we did a very, very large survey. We're going to be doing it every other year. If you go to suny.edu/climate survey, pretty simple URL, you could see the survey, and eventually you'll be able to see our data. Right now you can see all our IRB documents. Any institution that wants to take anything from there and use it, no problem. And we see about 1 in 3 of our students reporting sexual harassment. We see somewhat lower but quite alarming numbers of domestic violence and dating violence, of rape and sexual assault and stalking. We also have, and we're not ready to make it public yet, but a fairly sophisticated breakdown because these numbers are interesting, but actually sexual and interpersonal violence affect different groups very differently. Some of our students who are walking around, prevalence is just much higher in their identities than it is with other groups. And so the media has covered it. They say 1 in 5 women and 1 in 7 men, and there's your answer, and now off to sports. And that's just not an accurate representation of the experiences of our students on our colleges. Sexual and interpersonal violence is not evenly distributed, and by the way, it is distributed worse against those who come in with, many of whom already face significant barriers and challenges to getting to the institution in the first place and to staying there once they get there. So we saw that our numbers are fairly consistent with what other institutions have seen. We do ask about experiences in the prior year, so it is not lifetime experience. We thought that that would give us a bit more mud in the data than we wanted. We asked about the past year. We are able, through a very sophisticated process, to preload some data while also releasing it as soon as the student hits submit, so we can actually figure out what response came from whom. But it's a very sophisticated system, but we're able to understand the identities of the students who take it, and then there are a couple we ask them to self-identify. Interestingly, trans and gender non-binary students are overrepresented in our survey compared to their population as a whole. And we include specific opportunities to identify yourself in a number of ways there. So that is sort of our overall prevalence. I think when we switch to the next slide, what I want to talk about is results. So we know about the acute results, we know about the trauma, we know about medical needs and counseling needs. What I don't think any other survey answered, and what I was really, really keen to put in, is how many of our students change their academic plans or disappear after, and this is, as you might imagine, fewer students leave after harassment, more students leave after rape, and domestic violence, stalking are sort of somewhere in the middle. But, Emily, you made this great point about heart disease, and if in 1940 or 1950, the government had said, and leaders had said, heart disease is a huge problem, let's all change our policies, and let's see what free things we could do. Let's see what inexpensive things we could do. And if we just change the law and change the policies, heart disease is sure to come down. And I'm sure that that had some impact, but the federal government and states also spent billions of dollars on drugs and medicines and surgeries and all sorts of other things. And so, it's really a privilege to be here with leaders in the armed services and to sort of borrow a concept from you in order to get where I want to be 60 years from now. God willing, we'll all be there to see it. We need a Marshall Plan addressing sexual and interpersonal violence in the academies, in the service academies, in your forward operating positions, in large companies. The government tells us, change your policies and do a few things, and that will certainly change it. And it didn't work for drunk driving. We had Mothers Against Drunk Driving and all sorts of billboards, but you know what really worked? Changing it to .08 and raising the sentences and real research and the like. So I'm sorry, but I think those of us on our stage, and many of you out here have been doing this work, maybe we've come close to, or we've exhausted all the free things we could do, all the policy changes, all the advances there. And one of the things that I wanted to gather to kind of show that is that, by the way, there's a real impact. This is not students who change their major, that's a higher number. This is not students who transfer, that's a higher number. This is just our students who report being victims of these crimes, who left school, who exited the education pipeline. That means they are less likely to have good health outcomes, they're less likely to be married, they're more likely to suffer many of the things that public health worries about. They will likely live a less fulfilling life. A college degree versus a high school degree is $1 to $2 million of income over the course of their lifetime. And this is, by the way, for institutions of higher education, hundreds of millions of dollars of lost tuition revenue, of lost room and board, across the country, not just at our schools, of lost tuition, room and board, of lost future alumni dues and future football game tickets and all of that. So I hope that when we really go public with this, and I hope that institutions can look at and think about their experiences and the number of students who come forward there, and if they have similar students who are transferring out, who are just leaving school. This to me is the scariest one. These are students who just, I'm out. And we're worried, by the way, that this is a bit low because some of our students didn't make it to take the survey. But this is something that I hope that we have national leaders here, we have institutional leaders at a national level, and I hope we could think about, but we're gonna have to do more than policy changes, more than discussions and the like. It's gonna take a significant investment from the government and major institutions for us to get where I think you laid out so nicely where we should be.
Thank you for putting that data in the bigger context. Dr. Catena, we'll go to the next slide, and if you could share a little bit about some of the experiences and behaviors that you've been assessing in your campus climate surveys and how that data has affected your programming.
Sure. So before I get to the graph that's up there, the surveys that we use, so when we talk about domestic violence, intimate partner violence, sexual assault, those are huge umbrella terms. And what we see oftentimes is students are challenged with identifying, I was a victim or a survivor of assault. And as we're using these climate surveys, they are focusing more on behaviors rather than these kind of categories. And so when we're looking at these behaviors, we see an increase in prevalence rates because they're finally able to identify what some of these unhealthy behaviors are that historically we might have been socialized to believe are okay or are a rite of passage for colleges or military academies and et cetera. So I wanted to address that one piece, and what we have seen, and I don't have a graph for this one, we have seen an increase in reporting, but we've seen an increase in sexual harassment, which I think is one of the more challenging pieces to identify. And I really want to credit the folks in the room who've done training. Representative Howland earlier talked about the fact that UNM has trained almost 37,000 students in person. And so being able to really identify what those behaviors are empowers our students to then say, that wasn't okay. I want to either talk to someone confidentially, and huge shout out to our confidential advocates. We couldn't do this work without you all, but now we're starting to see the trends a little more accurately in terms of the climate for our university. With that, the training that they give at the beginning of the year for new student orientation also talks about our policies. And so when we look up here, we see the rates of students who know that UNM has a local sexual misconduct policy. In 2016, the total was at just under 65%. 2019, it was at 90%, which is great. But then I think that also goes to Mr. Kroger's point was, okay, now what? They know there's a policy there. Do they know what's in the policy? Can they understand the policy? If not, do they know where to go to be able to access some resources and support, or someone who might be able to translate that policy for them? This is a step in the right direction. It's progress, it's not a change yet. And so we were really glad to at least see that a majority of our students are aware of the fact that there is a policy, which I think also speaks to students understanding that the university does take this very seriously. This is on the forefront of many of our minds, and we don't want students to think that we don't think about this and think about their overall well-being. And then if we can go to the next slide, please. This is also something that Lieutenant General Silveria had pointed out earlier in terms of students coming in and not being a clean slate. They come in with their own values, their own morals, their own habits. And one of the campus climate surveys that we used asks about the last 12 months, but I actually do like the lifetime prevalence, because one of the things we see is they're not coming in as clean slates. Past victimization is huge for those who have responded. And so it's not just responding when we do receive a report, but knowing about the mental health kind of status of individuals who've already been victimized. For people who've experienced intergenerational transmissions of trauma, what does this look like? How can we then get ahead of the game and really talk about primary prevention and take care of our students that are coming in who are at a higher risk than maybe those who haven't been victimized in the past? And so I think that's really important for us to be able to start thinking about, okay, we see the ones for sense enrollment, but we don't know how long they've been here. If it's our graduate students, were they undergraduates here? Did they receive their master's here and then their PhD? If so, that's about a 10-year span. So what does that enrollment look like versus maybe a freshman who's filling this out? And so I think this really gives us a bigger picture in terms of our students, the work that we need to do, not just on the response piece, but also that primary prevention for those who have been victimized in the past.
In the interest of time, I'm going to cut you off there, but
Yep.
thank you. We're ready for a few questions. If you can go ahead and line up at the microphones, we'll go ahead and take some questions.
My name is Armando Estrada. I'm from Temple University. I've been doing a little bit of work in this area for quite some time, probably better part of 20 years. And one of the things, and I've done it in Sweden, I've done it with the U.S. Department of Defense, Georgia, Denmark, a lot of other places. And as a researcher, I believe in data. I think it's great, but sometimes data isn't enough, right? I mean, all these numbers are not new, okay? We've known that this is a problem for a very long time. Now, the interesting question that I have for you is, how do we leverage data to inform, influence, and impact discussions that we're having, right? So sexual harassment has come and gone from the defense sort of conscious. It only has become a major national level discussion. At the same time, sexual assault has done similar sorts of things. So how do we leverage data to inform, influence, and impact, discussing both problems together, right? Because, you know, as Dr. Hillman pointed out with that figure from the report, much of what the discussion kind of goes back and forth is those peaks. So, to you.
I think the combination is that, at least in military environments, it wasn't until we started looking at sexual assault rates and the people that also experienced sexual harassment that we realized that sexual harassment was a demonstrable risk factor for sexual assault, and that whole climate piece. So again, you're right. I think one of the things that we've all known that sexual assault is there, but I think for a lot of people, my mom included, I would just tell you that she's like, when I started to work in this area, she said, "Honey, is that really a problem in the military?" "Oh, yes, Mom. Yes, it is. I think there's a lot of ways that this data, and the more transparent that we are, can help people understand that, yes, this problem has existed for a long time, but how much, where, what are the risk factors, what are potential solutions? That's where this data will at least help us get to a good point to be able to chart a course for a future.
Take a question over here.
Hi, my name is Ruthie Watson. I'm from New Mexico Highlands University, main campus in Las Vegas. And so a couple of things, couple comments. First to Dr. Rothman. I also come from public health. And so I definitely believe in the progress that we've been able to make in certain areas. And I think the sexual assault area then and prevention, we still have a lot of work to do. Dr. Catena, I appreciate you talking about those layers and those experiences that our students come to us with, because without acknowledging that, we are not able to really do the best job we can. And so I can appreciate that. My question then to all of you on the panel then is, when we talk about higher education, a lot of time there's these territorial issues, right? You have faculty want to do this, student affairs wants to do that, campus police wants to do their thing, and nobody wants to talk about really what we need to do across the board. How do you get past that?
Thank you for that question. Two answers immediately come to mind. First is tone from the top. Leadership has to say that this is a priority. And the other piece that has been really successful here is having representatives from each of those areas on a team together. This way you build those relationships, you can start to build that trust that may have been broken historically within the institution, but then this way you also gain the perceptions from different areas that you might not necessarily consider. And so tone from the top, and then that collaboration is key.
Hi, I'm Kim Godderman. I'm a faculty member here at UNM. And I really appreciate your panel on the issue of identifying groups, right, in order to be able to collect data and take action. But in our conversations about campus climate, we are lacking a conversation about staff. Staff are also supervised by faculty, they're supervised by other staff, they also supervise student employees, and there's an inequality, right? There's a lack of balance of power in these relationships between staff and these other members of our campus. So how do we include this group in our conversations about campus climate?
Well, I'm pleased to say, from the SUNY perspective, we made the decision to do a uniform climate survey of our faculty and staff as well. So we will have, we're trying to get the student one out the door, and the data I showed you, just to be clear, is not yet weighted, so that's not our final. It'll change slightly, but that's just about where we are. We're going to also do that for staff, but I couldn't agree with you more that the need to bring folks to the table is so key. And, you know, we've had in our groups from everyone from presidents to faculty to police chiefs to everybody, and we want the best we can from each group so that others identify with them and know that their voice has been heard.
And with that, we're going to conclude our panel. I want to thank our panelists for their time and appreciate the engagement.
Thank you, another amazing panel. At this time, we have a brief video from Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa.
Hello, folks. This is Senator Joni Ernst, the junior senator from the great state of Iowa. Well, I'm sorry I can't be with you all in person today. I'm glad to be able to say a few words during this important event. As a survivor of sexual assault and someone who has made combating this issue one of my top priorities as a United States Senator, I am so grateful to all of you for participating in this conference. Sexual assault and harassment has plagued our society and impacted the lives of so many people across our nation, particularly those at our colleges, universities, and service academies. During my time at Iowa State University, I served as a volunteer counselor at a crisis center that provided shelter and support to survivors of abuse and sexual assault. I heard so many gut-wrenching stories of women and men fleeing abusers, suffering not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually as well. Unfortunately, many years later, these same stories continue to infect our college campuses. Just recently, an annual report from the Department of Defense detailed an increase in sexual assault reports at our U.S. military academies. While it's a good sign that more victims are starting to report these horrific instances, there's more we need to do to address these trends. We have got to continue to work on preventing sexual misconduct, no matter where it is in the first place. The young men and women across our country, like my daughter Libby, a cadet at West Point, deserve better. And that's why I'm committed to working together across the aisle in Washington, in partnerships with state and local government, and with folks like all of you to combat sexual assault and harassment on college campuses and beyond. Last year, I joined a Democratic senator from New York, Kirsten Gillibrand, to reintroduce bipartisan legislation that protects students and strengthens accountability and transparency at colleges and universities. Our bipartisan measure will make campuses safer and ensure victims are fairly heard by changing the way our universities handle sexual assault cases. And just last week, I led a bipartisan group of senators in calling for a briefing from the Pentagon and answers on what actions the Pentagon plans to take to address the spike in reports of sexual assault at our military academies. But the work doesn't end with Congress. We must challenge people to do better to protect victims from these horrendous assaults. And thanks to all of you, we're making progress. The work you're doing and the conversations you're having today serve as a model for our institutions across our country. If we really want to combat this issue, these are the hard discussions we must have. Thank you for allowing me to share a few thoughts today, and thank you all for the work that you are doing on this important issue. I'll continue to be a voice on this issue in the Senate and stand ready to work with all of you to combat sexual assault in our society. Thank you, and God bless you.
This concludes the morning general session, but before we adjourn, I'd like to especially recognize for the people who've been joining us through live stream. Thank you for the important conversation that we've been having. On behalf of our hosts, President Stokes, the University of New Mexico, the Secretary, and the Department of the Navy, we all appreciate your effort and your commitment. We ask that you continue to have this conversation. Those of us in the room will be doing that for the rest of the day. But throughout that and beyond that, and we look forward to seeing you at the national discussion, which will be held at West Point the first weekend of April. So thank you very much.